course, hello. My name is Dominik Zaum. I'm Professor of Governance, Conflict and Security here at the University of Reading. So, hybridity at its most basic is the notion that a political order, in particular its norms, its institutions, reflect the norms and interests of multiple of different parties. So in a sense, it is a compromised version of a pure or idealized notion of a particular political order. And it really gained prominence in the context of peace and conflict studies as an effort to explain why the local reality of post-war orders didn't necessarily match the idealized and stylized blueprints and international blueprints for a country. Now, as an observation that a political order is hybrid, it's really quite banal and seems obvious. Any political order is negotiated. It's constantly negotiated and renegotiated. It isn't fixed. And that's even more so true for post-conflict contexts, which tend to be more fluid. Now, that the reality on the ground doesn't reflect the technocratic blueprints of international institutions, but the massive political bargains that arise from the engagement with local political actors, therefore shouldn't come as a surprise. So I think it's really helpful to focus on hybridization as a process rather than hybridity as an outcome, because as I said, hybridity as an outcome is in a sense quite banal. But when we start to look at hybridization as a process, it kind of shifts our gaze towards both the actors but also the nature of their interactions and the political and power dynamics between them. Now, I think we can tease out some quite common examples which we would see across a wide range of contexts. And probably one of the most common ones are the tensions between international law, in particular formal international human rights law on the one hand, and traditional law on the other. So for me, an important case of this in context of peace and state building has been in East Timor, where the then UN mission tried to set up a formal legal system, but lacked the capacity to implement this across the country, and very quickly this formal legal system with very limited capacity sort of rubbed along and existed alongside traditional forms of law, which focused very much on collective responsibility, which focused on mediation or compensation rather than other notions of justice, and where there were quite significant conflicts between the principles of formal human rights law on the one hand and traditional law on the other, especially, for example, with regard to gender and gender roles. Now, I think what is interesting about the hybridization process is two things. On the one hand, there were two conflicting norms, or sets of norms, that in a sense didn't necessarily reconcile, but somehow sort of rubbed along each other and kind of continuously conflict at different levels. Those that inform traditional law on the one hand and international human rights law on the other. But then there were also questions of capacity. Why did this really become important? It is because there was never the capacity to really roll out a comprehensive formal system of law and of the rule of law. And in a sense, traditional law always filled in the gaps, or competed in areas where the state, or probably more precisely the international community, tried to roll that out into. But this idea of sort of traditional law or traditional institutions filling the gaps where the state is absent, I think is a really important aspect of the reality of hybridity. And it starts to highlight the places where this negotiation and renegotiation between the two continues to take place. It's very often in the everyday, not necessarily the big formal institutions. And then I think comes to a second interesting example that I just wanted to tease out, and that's with regard to institutional design. And a really good example here, and quite a prominent one, is Afghanistan and the role of the lawyer jirgas, the kind of formal and sort of traditional assemblies. And I think with regard to hybridity, there are really two quite interesting questions. The first one is, what is the role of the lawyer jirga as a kind of traditional mechanism of conflict resolution, of rulemaking in a kind of formal constitutional framework? And how do you try to reconcile those two? Especially when you move beyond the moment of a kind of constitutional assembly as sort of a one-off event, but give these lawyer jirgas a kind of more regular role in the ongoing political process. And then, of course, it's the question around the membership of these loyalty agreements, and to what extent should they reflect the kind of norms that the international community brings to peace and state building, or should there be a representation of all different ethnic groups and horizontally, should it involve, should it be inclusive of women, of other underrepresented groups, groups traditionally marginalized in the policy process in many countries. So, or should it really just reflect more traditional norms, existing power relations? Should it reflect the warlords? So there are a range of different things that rub against each other, and now I think these areas are really interesting to look at, because here in these hybridization processes we can see the political and the power dynamics, and importantly we don't just see them as a dyad between the local and the international, but they allow us to start to disaggregate both of these, that both the international community or the international presence has multiple interests and to some extent represents and reflects multiple normative frameworks, but in particular also local political actors, even if they act in a relatively common normative framework, have very, very varying interests. And so these processes highlight the negotiation not just between locals and internationals, but also within them.